Rain poured over the Rollins ranch the day she showed up, a young woman, drenched, barefoot, clutching a crying baby to her chest. The men on the porch just stared. "Please," she said, voice trembling. "No one wants me, but I can nurse the baby." Most would have turned her away. But the cowboy, Eli Rollins, saw something in her eyes, a quiet strength, the kind born from loss. He stepped forward, tipped his hat, and said softly, "You're wanted here." None of them knew then that this woman's arrival would heal more than a child. It would reopen a heart that had been buried with the past. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The storm clawed at the windows, wind screaming through the chinks in the old boards like a chorus of ghosts. But inside the Rollins ranch, the air was thick and heavy, carrying the smell of wet earth, wood smoke, and something else, uncertainty. Eli Rollins closed the door behind the woman and her child, bolting it against the gale, his boots leaving dark trails of mud across the floorboards. The baby's cries were thin and desperate, the sound of something too small to understand the cruelty of the world, and it cut through the silence of the room like a knife. "Easy now," Eli murmured, grabbing an old blanket from the back of the chair and wrapping it around her trembling shoulders. The fabric was rough, smelling faintly of horse and cedar, but the woman clutched it tight, as if afraid it might vanish. The ranch hand standing by the fire exchanged looks. Tommy, the youngest, shifted his weight uneasily, while old Cade spat into the hearth, muttering under his breath about bad luck following wet strangers. Eli ignored them. He'd lived long enough to know that a man didn't measure decency in comfort or convenience. "Sit yourself down," he said quietly. She hesitated before obeying, lowering herself onto the bench near the fire, the baby cradled against her chest, its tiny face red and scrunched with cold. Eli crouched by the hearth, stoking the flames higher until the room glowed in flickering amber, shadows dancing across the log walls like restless spirits. "What's your name, miss?" he asked, not looking at her, just stirring the embers. She was silent long enough that he thought she might not answer at all. Then finally she said, "Mary." The word came out brittle, too careful, as if it had been chosen from a shelf of borrowed names. Eli lifted his gaze, studying her through the smoke. She was young, though life had carved years into her face that time alone couldn't account for. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the Tate blanket around the baby, eyes downcast, avoiding his like a sinner at confession. "Mary," he repeated softly, testing it on his tongue. "All right then, Mary." He didn't ask more. Truth had a way of showing itself when it was ready, and pressing a wounded thing only made it bite. He reached for the pot hanging over the fire, poured steaming stew into a bowl, and set it before her. "Ain't much, but it's hot." She nodded, murmured something that might have been thanks, and took a spoonful with trembling fingers. The baby's cries eased as the warmth settled back into the room, replaced by the steady rhythm of rain hammering on the roof. The other men lingered by the doorway, whispering low. "Boss," Cade said finally, his voice rough. "We can't keep her here. Don't know who she is, what she's running from." Eli straightened slowly, turning to face them. "Ain't our job to judge the storms that drive folks to our door," he said evenly. "We just keep the fire lit." Cade frowned but said nothing more, retreating into the corner where the lamplight faded. Eli turned back to the woman, whose eyes flicked up just long enough for him to catch the gratitude there, raw, hesitant, but real. For a moment, neither spoke. The thunder outside rumbled low and distant, rolling over the valley like a warning that hadn't yet found its shape. Eli stirred the fire again, the light catching the lines in his face, carved deep from years of loss and weather. "You're safe here, Mary," he said quietly, though the words tasted strange. Outside, lightning split the sky wide open, and in that flash of white, something shifted between them, something fragile, uncertain, and bound to change everything before the storm was done. The dawn came gray and reluctant, dragging light across the soaked plains as the storm slunk off toward the horizon, leaving behind a world washed clean but uneasy. Inside the Rollins ranch, the smell of damp wood and coffee filled the air, mingling with the low murmur of men who'd been up since before first light. The bunkhouse was alive with whispers quiet enough to seem harmless, but sharp enough to cut if left unchecked. "Ain't right," Cade muttered, lacing up his boots. Woman shows up in the dead of night with a baby. No husband. No story worth telling, don't sit right with me. Tommy, all of 19 and still soft around the edges, frowned as he spooned sugar into his coffee. Maybe she's just trying to survive, Cade. Ain't like this land gives mercy to anyone. Cade snorted. Survivors don't lie about their names. Across the room, one of the hands laughed under his breath. Bet she's running from something. Could be the law, could be worse. Don't matter, Rawlins'll find out soon enough. But when Eli stepped through the door, the talk died faster than a shot in the dark. He filled the frame, rain slicker still dripping, his jaw set in that way that said he'd heard every word and didn't care to hear another. She stays, he said simply, his voice low but heavy enough to silence the room. Ain't no more to be said on it. Cade opened his mouth to argue, but Eli's stare pinned him quiet. The cowboy poured himself a cup of coffee, took a slow sip, and left the bunkhouse without another word. The hands watched him go, exchanging uneasy glances, the weight of his decision settling on them like the lingering scent of smoke after lightning. Out by the main house, Mary was sitting on the porch, the baby in her arms wrapped in one of Eli's old wool blankets. The child's tiny hands grasped at the morning light, and for the first time since the storm, the air felt almost gentle. Eli watched her, from the edge of the yard, unnoticed for a moment. She moved with quiet purpose, her every motion careful, deliberate, as if the whole world might shatter if she wasn't soft enough. The sight stirred something unfamiliar in him, something that made the noise of the ranch fade away. When she finally looked up, her smile was small and shy, but there was a weight behind it, a flicker of sorrow that even kindness couldn't hide. Didn't mean to cause trouble, she said softly, rocking the baby. Ain't trouble, he replied. Men just like to talk when their hands ain't busy. She nodded, her gaze drifting toward the open range, where the fog was lifting off the grass in thin silver sheets. They're not wrong, though, she murmured after a moment. About me. Eli studied her, saying nothing. Her fingers tightened around the child, the tremor so slight most would have missed it, but he saw. Whatever you're running from, he said finally, ain't my business unless it finds its way here. Till then, you're safe. She met his eyes, and for the first time, he saw the ghost of something fierce beneath her fear, a spark that had survived whatever fire she'd come through. You don't even know my story, she said. Don't need to, he answered, tipping his hat slightly. World's hard enough without demanding confessions from those trying to live through it. She smiled again, but it faltered at the edges, that haunted shadow still clinging to her like a second skin. The baby stirred, cooing softly, and she bent to hush it, her voice tender as a prayer. From the bunkhouse, Eli could feel the men watching through the window, their curiosity burning like lantern light, but he ignored them. He turned instead toward the open plains, where the clouds were breaking and the sun bled through thin, weak, but real. As he walked back toward the corral, he caught himself glancing once more at the woman on his porch, the stranger with secrets in her eyes, and thought, not for the first time, that the storm hadn't truly passed at all. It had just changed its shape. The afternoon sun bled gold across the valley, warm enough to draw steam from the drenched earth, but the air around the Rawlins ranch still carried the echo of the storm that had brought her there. Eli Rawlins stood by the wash barrel, sleeves rolled up, hands rough with soap and cold water. The woman's dress, Mary's dress, hung heavy in his grip, the once pale fabric now stained with mud and travel. He hadn't meant to find anything. He was just trying to help, same as he'd been doing since she stumbled out of the rain. But when he wrung the water from the hem, something crinkled beneath the lining, faint but unmistakable. Eli frowned, reaching carefully into the seam until his fingers found the edge of damp paper, folded small and hidden deep. He hesitated, then drew it out, a letter, creased and nearly ruined by the storm. The ink had bled, but the words were still there, ghost-like, yet clear enough to chill him. They took him. Ride east if you want to live. The handwriting was delicate, hurried, as though written by someone with shaking hands. He stood there for a long moment, the water dripping from his knuckles into the dirt, the message twisting in his mind. Who was they? And who had been taken? He looked toward the house, where Mary sat in the fading light, humming softly to the baby as she fed him. her face half hidden in shadow. She looked so small, so breakable. It almost felt cruel to disturb her peace. But the words on that paper wouldn't let him rest. When he finally stepped onto the porch, she looked up, startled by the creak of the boards. "Eli?" she asked, her voice uncertain. He held out the letter, his expression unreadable. "Found this in your dress," he said. Didn't mean to pry, but it near fell out itself. For a heartbeat, she just stared at it, the color draining from her face until she looked as pale as the linen wrapped around the baby. Then, with trembling fingers, she snatched the paper from his hand, clutching it to her chest like a wound she didn't want touched. "Where'd you get this?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Washed out of your pocket," he said. "You care to tell me what it means?" Her breath quickened, eyes darting toward the door as if expecting someone to burst through it. "Please," she said, her words trembling. "Don't ask me about it. If they find me, if they know I'm still alive, they'll take the child too." Eli watched her closely. She wasn't lying. Fear like that couldn't be faked. It came from deep down, from somewhere old and raw. He set his hands on the back of a chair, knuckles white against the wood. "You're in danger," he said quietly. "That much is plain. But danger has a way of following secrets." She looked up at him, her eyes wide and glistening. "You don't understand," she whispered. "If you knew who they were, what they've done, you'd turn me out yourself." Eli shook his head slowly. "Don't reckon I would." Her breath hitched, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind stirred the last of the storm's debris, rattling the window shutters like distant footsteps. Eli stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You got my word, Mary. Whatever trouble's on your heels, it don't cross this door unless I let it." A tear slipped down her cheek, vanishing into the collar of her borrowed dress. "You shouldn't get involved," she said softly. "It'll destroy you too." He gave a quiet, humorless smile. "Already been destroyed once," he murmured. "Ain't much left for the world to take." She turned away, holding the baby tight, her shoulders shaking as she whispered a prayer he couldn't quite catch. Eli watched her in silence, the crumpled letter still burning in his mind like a brand, and realized that whatever she'd fled from wasn't finished with her. Somewhere out there, in the vast quiet beyond the hills, the storm was gathering again, only this time it had a name. The knock came just after noon, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the steady hum of chores and the baby's soft cries. Eli wiped his hands on a rag and opened the door to find Doc Hanley standing there, his coat damp from the drizzle, his bag in hand and curiosity already gleaming behind his spectacles. "Heard you had a little one in need of looking over," the doctor said, stepping inside before Eli could answer. Hanley had been tending to the Rollins ranch for near 15 years, seen Eli through more broken bones and whiskey aches than anyone else alive, and he moved through the house like a man accustomed to being welcome. Mary sat by the hearth, the baby in her arms, his cheeks flushed but his breathing easy now, the worst of the cold behind him. She looked up nervously as Hanley approached, instinctively tightening her hold around the child. "Now, don't you worry, miss," the doctor said kindly, kneeling beside her. "Just want to make sure the little feller's doing all right." He opened his bag and began his work, gentle but efficient, humming under his breath as he checked the baby's pulse and peered into his tiny mouth. "Healthy lungs," he said with a nod. "You've done fine by him, ma'am." Mary's shoulders relaxed a fraction, and for a fleeting moment, she smiled an expression so soft and unguarded that it caught Eli off guard entirely. But then Hanley froze mid-motion, his brow furrowing as he studied her face. "Hold on," he said slowly, his voice suddenly careful. "I know you." The words fell like a hammer on stone. The room went still, the fire popped, the wind moaned faintly outside, and Eli felt something cold coil in his gut. "Ain't you," the doctor began, squinting through the dim light. "Ain't you the widow from the Preston homestead?" The color drained from Mary's face as if he'd struck her. Her lips parted, but no sound came out, just a sharp intake of breath. Eli looked from one to the other, his mind turning over the name, the memory it stirred. Preston. He'd heard it before everyone in the territory had. A man of wealth and reputation, whose ranch had been the envy of half the county until it was torn apart by greed and gunfire. Rumor said Daniel Preston had been murdered in his own barn over debts owed to men who didn't forgive easily. His wife, they said, had fled into the storm that same night, her newborn in her arms, vanishing before anyone could question her. Eli's throat tightened. "Doc," he said slowly. "You sure of that?" Hanley adjusted his spectacles, looking flustered. "I'd stake my life on it. I delivered that child. For God's sake, Daniel Preston's boy." The baby whimpered, as if the sound of his father's name had unsettled even him. Mary rose from the chair, pale and trembling, her back pressed against the wall. "Please," she whispered. "Don't say that name. Not here." Her voice cracked like old wood, under strain. "They'll hear." Eli stepped toward her, hands raised slightly, his tone steady but soft. "Ain't nobody here gonna hurt you, Mary, if that's even your name. But you need to tell me what's real, or I can't protect what I don't understand." She shook her head violently, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You can't protect us," she said. "Not from them. They killed my husband, and they won't stop till they've taken everything, his land, his legacy, his son." The doctor looked stricken, guilt flickering across his features. "I didn't mean harm, ma'am, I just—" "You've done enough," she snapped, her fear breaking into anger. The baby began to cry again, loud and panicked, and Eli felt the sound cut through him like a blade. He turned to Hanley. "You ain't seen her," he said firmly. "Ain't heard nothin', ain't said nothin', understand?" The doctor hesitated, then nodded, tucking his bag under his arm as he shuffled toward the door. "God help you both," he muttered before stepping out into the rain. The door shut behind him with a heavy thud. Eli turned back to her, but Mary wouldn't meet his eyes. She just held her child close, whispering broken words against his hair. Outside, thunder grumbled far off in the distance again, soft but growing closer, and Eli knew that whatever storm had sent her to his doorstep wasn't finished yet. It was only finding its way home. The evening came in slow and uneasy, the kind of dusk that seemed to hold its breath. The wind had died, leaving the world still and listening, and Eli Rollins didn't much like when the prairie got that quiet. He'd been fixing a latch on the corral gate when he saw it hoofprints, pressed deep into the soft earth, circling close before veering off toward the ridge. Not the tracks of a stray or passing traveler. No, these were careful, deliberate, the kind a man makes when he's studying something from the shadows. Eli crouched low, running his calloused hand along the impression in the dirt. The rain had ended nearly 2 days ago. These prints were newer than that made within hours. His stomach sank. He looked up toward the darkening horizon, where the last light of day bled into the hills like a dying fire, and felt the cold weight of knowing settle deep in his chest. Someone had found them or was damn close to trying. He didn't tell Mary. No good ever came from frightening a mother already running from ghosts. Instead, he sent the men in early, claiming he wanted to keep watch over the horses himself, and when the lamps were out and the ranch had gone still, he sat by the window with his rifle laid across his knees, the barrel cold against his hand. Outside, the night stretched wide and black, the moon hidden behind a shroud of cloud. Every creak of the wood, every sigh of the wind through the eaves, set his nerves on edge. He'd lived through enough ambushes and bad dealings to know when danger was near, and tonight the air tasted of it. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called long, low, and lonely. Then silence again, broken only by the soft ticking of the clock above the mantel and the faint breathing from Mary's room down the hall. Eli's eyes drifted there once, just long enough to see the sliver of lamplight beneath her door. She was awake, too, probably rocking the baby in that old chair by the hearth, humming those soft, wordless tunes that made the child still. He wanted to tell her everything, to warn her about the tracks, the feeling that the past was closing in, but something in her face these last few days had kept him quiet. She'd lost too much already. He wasn't about to add fear to it. So he waited. The hours crawled by like wounded things. The lamp burned low, his coffee went cold, and the stars slipped west, leaving the land draped in shadow. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped. Eli's hand tightened on the rifle, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. He rose slowly, peering through the frost-blurred window toward the corral. Nothing moved, just the fence line, the ghost of mist curling off the ground. But then came a sound that froze him to the bone. A baby's cry. Thin, desperate, unmistakable. It carried across the yard like a knife through glass. His stomach dropped. He turned toward Mary's room, ready to storm through the door, but stopped dead when he heard the soft, steady breathing of the child still inside. The cry outside came again, closer this time, echoing through the darkness like a mockery. Eli swung the door open, the cold night air rushing in, stinging his face as he stepped onto the porch, rifle raised. "Who's out there?" he barked. The only answer was the whisper of wind and that eerie, lingering wail. It came from somewhere near the barn, fading into the distance before vanishing altogether. He stood there for a long time, the dawn creeping slow and pale over the ridge, his heart pounding with the weight of what he'd just heard. When the first light hit the yard, the tracks were gone, swept clean by the wind, but the echo of that cry still haunted the air, as if the land itself had tried to speak a warning. And in that moment, Eli Rollins knew the truth. Whoever had come in the night wasn't just looking for Mary. They were letting him know they'd already found her. By noon, the sun sat high and hot over the plains, beating down on the ranch until every fence post threw a sharp, thin shadow across the dust. The morning chores had come and gone, but Eli Rollins hadn't shaken the unease that had settled in him since the night before. The sound of that phantom cry still echoed somewhere deep in his skull, like a splinter he couldn't dig out. He'd been oiling the hinges on the barn door when he heard the rhythmic crunch of hooves on dry soil, steady and unhurried, the sound of men who wanted to be heard arriving. 2 riders came into view along the road, their horses sleek and clean, their coats shining too fine for ranch work. These weren't drifters or cowhands. They were the kind of men who didn't come calling without a reason. Eli straightened, wiping his hands on a rag as the pair reined in by the porch. "Mornin', friend," the taller one said, tipping his hat with a smile too polished to mean a damn thing. He was dressed like a city man, black suit, silver watch chain glinting against his vest, boots with not a speck of mud on them. His partner, shorter but broad-shouldered, kept his eyes hidden beneath the brim of his hat, scanning the yard with the calm attention of a wolf in daylight. "Fine spread you've got here," the first man said easily. "Name's Coulter. My associate here's Mr. Brand. We're with the Well, you might say a Christian charity, out of Carson Junction." Eli raised an eyebrow, leaning against the porch post, arms crossed. "That so?" "Yes, sir," Coulter continued, sliding from his saddle and dusting off his gloves. "We're looking for a woman. Goes by the name Mary Preston, or she might have taken another. Tragic case, really. Poor thing's wandered off with an infant that doesn't belong to her. We're just trying to bring 'em both someplace safe." Eli's jaw tightened, though his expression didn't change. "Can't say I know anyone by that name," he said evenly. "Ain't had much company out this way lately." Coulter smiled, all teeth and condescension. "Funny thing, though, folks in town said a young woman passed through last week, heading this direction. Described her real particular. Drenched, travel, worn, carrying a babe. You wouldn't have happened to—" "You boys want coffee?" Eli interrupted, turning toward the porch steps. "Got some on the stove. Bit strong, but it'll do." The taller man chuckled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's mighty kind of you, mister." "Rollins," Eli said, pulling open the door. Eli Rollins. He motioned for them to follow, but the way he said his own name was a warning in itself. Inside, the air felt thick with tension. Eli poured 3 cups, the only sound the clink of ceramic on the wood table. Coulter took a sip and smiled like a man savoring a lie. "Much obliged," he said. "Fine place you've got here. Peaceful. Hope it stays that way." Brand said nothing, just watched the room, his gaze lingering on the closed door down the hall where Mary was no doubt holding her breath. Eli noticed and smiled without warmth. "You boys ride far. You'll want to water them horses before you head back." Coulter stood, setting his untouched cup down. "Appreciate the kindness. If you see her, Mary, the widow Preston, tell her there's folks who just want to help." "I'll be sure to do that," Eli said, voice calm but flat. They tipped their hats, mounted up, and rode off slow, leaving 2 perfect lines of hoofprints fading into the dust. Eli stood on the porch, watching until they were no more than specks on the horizon, his hand never once leaving the rifle propped by the door. When he finally turned back inside, Mary was standing there in the shadowed hall, pale as chalk, clutching the child close to her chest. "They found us," she whispered. Eli's eyes met hers, steady and hard. Not yet, he said. But they will if we don't start thinking 2 steps ahead. The wind picked up again, carrying the faint scent of rain over the plains, and for the first time, Eli realized the storm had never really left it, had just put on a clean suit and come knocking at his door. The night came down heavy, a velvet shroud over the plains, the kind that swallowed the stars and left only the restless glow of the hearth to hold back the dark. The wind moaned low through the rafters, carrying with it the faint scent of distant rain, and the fire in Eli's cabin burned slow and steady, its light painting the walls in shifting bands of gold and shadow. Mary sat close to the flames, her face pale, eyes fixed on the dancing embers as though the truth she'd kept buried might be hiding in their glow. Eli sat opposite her, his chair tilted slightly back, the rifle leaning against the wall within easy reach, though tonight he wasn't thinking about the men who might come. He was watching her, watching the tremor in her hands, the way she held the baby close even now, as if the warmth of her body alone might keep the world at bay. For a long time, neither spoke. The fire popped, the clock ticked, and outside, the night pressed against the windows like a living thing. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice soft and raw. "You ever love someone so much? You thought losing them would take the air right out of your lungs?" Eli didn't answer right away. His mind flickered, unbidden, to the grave that lay on the far edge of the property, a wooden cross, no name carved, just a simple mark for a wife and child lost too soon. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I know something about that." Mary nodded, her gaze never leaving the fire. "Then you'll understand why I did what I did." She drew a slow, shaking breath. "My husband Daniel, he wasn't just a rancher. He was part of a deal with men who had money in their veins instead of blood. They said they wanted to expand the rail line, cut across our land, make us rich. But Daniel saw what they were really after: control. He tried to pull out. They warned him once. Then they came back." Her voice faltered, the words catching in her throat like thorns. "They killed him in front of me, Eli, right there in our barn. He told me to run before they dragged him out. I had our baby in my arms, and the storm was coming down so hard I could barely see the road." She stopped, her hand trembling as she brushed a tear from her cheek. "I didn't even bury him. I just ran. I've been running ever since." The fire hissed as a log shifted, sparks flaring and dying in the dim light. Eli leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his face unreadable but his eyes burning with quiet fury. "Those men, the ones who came today, they the same?" She nodded slowly. "Coulter and Brand. Daniel trusted them once. They took everything when he died, his ranch, his name, the future meant for our child. Now they want the rest of it buried." Her voice cracked, and for a moment she looked so fragile he thought she might shatter right there. "All I had left was her," she whispered, glancing down at the baby sleeping peacefully in her lap. "They call her stolen, but she's all that's good left of him." Eli's jaw tightened, the muscle ticking in his cheek. "Ain't no law worth following that calls a mother a thief for keeping her child safe," he said, his voice low and rough. The firelight caught the lines in his face, making him look older, sterner, carved from the same hard earth he'd worked all his life. For a long while, neither spoke again. The only sound was the steady crackle of the flames and the faint sigh of wind through the eaves, like the world itself was holding its breath. Finally, Mary looked up, her eyes rimmed red but steadier now. "You should have turned me away that first night," she said. "You'd be safer." Eli met her gaze, his own calm and certain. "Maybe," he said, "but I reckon some things are worth the trouble." The baby stirred in her arms, sighing softly. And for the first time since she'd come to him, a small, fragile peace settled between them, born not of safety, but of shared sorrow. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying the scent of rain across the plains, and Eli knew that whatever came next, neither of them would be facing it alone. The night split open with the first crack of gunfire, a sound that sent the horses screaming in their stalls and the firelight spilling wild against the horizon. Eli was out of bed before the second shot, bare feet hitting the floorboards, the acrid scent of smoke already crawling through the walls. He grabbed the shotgun from the mantel, thumbed back the hammer, and tore open the front door. The barn was ablaze, flames leaping skyward like some furious thing unchained, painting the plains in red and gold. Shadows moved through the firelight men, half a dozen or more, their faces obscured by dust and brimmed hats, their rifles glinting in the moonlight. One voice rose above the crackle and roar, smooth and venomous, the kind of tone that made decent men reach for their guns. "Mary Preston!" Coulter shouted. His words carried on the smoke. "You can't hide behind a ranch hand forever. Send her out, and maybe we'll let the boy live." The lie in his voice was as thick as the smoke itself. Eli stepped off the porch, the wind tearing at his coat, his boots sinking into the wet earth. "You'll have to go through me first," he called back, his voice steady, deep, the kind that didn't need shouting to carry. A brief silence followed, the kind that always comes before blood is spilled. Then Brand's rifle flashed from the shadows, and the world exploded into motion. Eli fired first, the recoil slamming against his shoulder, dropping one man near the corral. The others scattered, shouting, their boots pounding the dirt as sparks rained from the burning barn. Another shot whistled past his ear, close enough to tear his hat clean off. But he didn't flinch. He advanced instead, slow and deliberate, like a man who'd made peace with dying so long as he didn't do it on his knees. The flames roared higher, feeding on hay and timber, and the night turned to a hellish daylight. "Eli!" Mary's voice came from the doorway behind him, sharp with terror. He turned just enough to see her clutching the baby to her chest, the firelight reflected in her wide, desperate eyes. "Get back inside!" he barked, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Stay low, and don't come out till I say." She hesitated only a heartbeat before obeying, slamming the door shut just as another volley of gunfire ripped through the yard. The fence post splintered, and Eli dropped behind a trough, firing back with precision born of 100 hard lessons. One man went down near the well, another by the paddock, their cries drowned out by the inferno consuming the barn. The smell of burning straw and gunpowder filled the air, choking and hot. But Eli pressed on, moving from cover to cover, reloading between breaths. "You don't have to die for her, Rollins." Coulter's voice came again, closer now, mocking. "She's just another liar with a pretty face." "So are you," Eli muttered, leveling his gun toward the sound. When Coulter stepped into view, his white shirt smeared with smoke and sweat, Eli didn't hesitate. The shot rang out like thunder, and Coulter dropped hard, his body crumpling into the dirt. Brand froze where he stood, his revolver raised but shaking, eyes darting between the fire and the man who refused to fall. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Eli took a step forward. "Go on," he said, voice rough and low. "Be smart, and ride out. This land's had enough blood for one night." Brand swallowed, the fight draining from him like whiskey from a cracked flask. He backed away slowly, then turned and vanished into the smoke, the hoofbeats of his horse fading into the distance. Eli stood there long after the shooting stopped, the shotgun still warm in his hands, the rain beginning to fall again, thin, steady, merciful. When he finally turned back toward the house, Mary was there in the doorway, her face streaked with tears and soot. The baby clutched tight against her heart. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words failed her. Behind them, the barn collapsed in a burst of sparks, lighting the sky like the end of the world. Eli just nodded, lowering the shotgun. "It's over," he said, though they both knew better. The wolves had come for her once and failed, but wolves, he also knew, never stopped hunting until they'd eaten or died trying. By morning, the storm had burned itself out, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt sacred. The barn was nothing but a smoldering skeleton of black beams and glowing ash, its smoke curling into the pale dawn like the last breath of something once alive. The air reeked of soot and blood and gunpowder, and the land itself looked wounded, fence lines torn, earth churned by hooves and fire. The remnants of the fight scattered across the yard. Eli Rollins stood in the middle of it all, shoulders heavy, hands blackened with smoke, the shotgun still hanging loose in his grip. He'd been awake through the night, too tired to feel the pain in his ribs, too numb to think about how close it had come. When the first light broke over the ridge, painting the horizon gold, he finally lowered the gun and took a long, slow breath. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open. Mary stepped out barefoot, her hair loose, her face pale and streaked with soot, the baby swaddled close against her chest. For a moment, She said nothing, just stared at what was left of the barn, her eyes wide and glassy. Then she whispered, "You saved us." Eli shook his head, his voice rough. "No, ma'am. Just bought us a little more time." But before she could answer, the sound of hoofbeats rolled across the valley, steady, measured, familiar. The sheriff rode in with 2 deputies, the morning light glinting off the tin star pinned to his vest. Sheriff Dunn was a hard man, built like the land itself, broad, worn, and slow to trust what he couldn't see. He reined in beside the wreckage, his horse snorting at the smell of smoke. "Heard the gunfire all the way from town," he said, scanning the scorched yard. "Looks like you had yourself a hell of a night, Rollins." Eli nodded once. "Could say that." Dunn dismounted, his boots crunching on the charred ground. His eyes swept over the fallen men still lying where they'd dropped. "You plan on telling me what happened here?" Eli hesitated, glancing at Mary, who clutched the baby tighter. He thought about lying, keeping her name hidden a while longer, but there was no more hiding left to do. "Those men," he said slowly, "came for her. Said she'd stolen a child. They were hired guns working for Preston's old business partners." The sheriff raised a brow. "Preston? The one who got himself shot over land titles and debts?" "That's the one," Eli said. "Seems the same men who killed him wanted to clean up what was left." Dunn's jaw tightened as he looked over the bodies. "Looks like they found their own justice instead." He motioned to his deputies. "Round up whoever's still breathing. We'll take 'em in." As they moved to obey, one of the wounded outlaws, Brand, his leg torn by buckshot, groaned from where he lay near the trough. The sheriff crouched beside him. "You'll tell me who paid you," Dunn said flatly. Brand spat blood and muttered something about unfinished business, but the fight was gone from his voice. Within the hour, the surviving men were chained to their saddles, the rest left for burial once the preacher came. The sheriff tipped his hat to Eli. "You did right, Rollins. Don't often say that about men who kill, but sometimes the law just shows up too late." Then he turned his gaze to Mary. "Ma'am, I'll need your statement soon as you're ready." She nodded faintly, her eyes still locked on the ashes. "Thank you, Sheriff." When they rode off, the world went quiet again except for the faint crackle of dying embers. Mary stepped closer to Eli, her free hand trembling as it found his arm. "I thought I'd lost everything," she said, her voice thick with exhaustion and wonder. "But you gave me more than I deserved." Eli looked at her, then at the horizon where the first real light of morning burned through the smoke. "Ain't about what we deserve," he said. "It's about what we hold on to when the rest is gone." For a long moment they just stood there. 2 souls bound by fire and loss and something unspoken that didn't need to be named. Behind them, the ashes whispered in the wind, and before them, the sun rose over the blackened land, proof that even after the worst of nights, the dawn still had a way of finding its way home. Weeks passed, and the land began to heal the way only the frontier could, slowly, stubbornly, but with the quiet promise of renewal. The black scars where the barn once stood were now just dark patches of soil, rich with ash and the memory of fire. New beams rose from the earth, strong and straight, the smell of fresh-cut pine drifting on the breeze. The men worked from dawn to dusk, hammers ringing like distant church bells, the rhythm of rebuilding echoing across the wide valley. Mary was there every morning, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hands roughened by rope and splinters, her hair tied back beneath a sun-faded scarf. She mended fences, hauled water, stitched torn saddles, never once asking to be spared the work. The baby, now chubbier and louder, lay in a cradle Eli had built himself, resting on the porch where the sunlight spilled warm across the boards. Sometimes the men would pause just to watch, grinning at the sight of her cooing as Mary sang softly, her voice carrying across the yard like a lullaby for the whole ranch. They still called her Miss Preston. But there was a new tone to it now, not suspicion, not pity, but respect. Even old Cade, gruff as a mule, took to tipping his hat when she passed. "Ain't seen a woman work like that since the war," he'd mutter, earning nods from the others. Eli said little about it, but he saw everything. The way Mary's laughter came a little easier now, the way she looked less like a woman on the run, and more like one finding her place in the world again. He'd catch her watching the sunrise sometimes, standing by the fence with the baby in her arms, her eyes fixed on the horizon as if she still couldn't believe she'd lived to see another dawn. And each time, something in his chest would tighten, not the ache of loss he'd carried for years, but something gentler, like the earth softening after frost. The ranch itself was coming back to life, too. Calves bawled in the pastures. The creek ran clear again, and the fields that had once burned now shimmered gold beneath the setting Sunday. The hands had their laughter back, and in the evenings, when supper was done, music sometimes drifted from the bunkhouse, an old fiddle, a harmonica, a rough song about hard times turning. On one such evening, when the air was painted red and gold and the day's heat still clung to the porch, Mary stepped out with the baby asleep against her shoulder. Eli was there, leaning against the post, a piece of straw between his teeth, watching the light die over the hills. She stood beside him for a while, neither of them speaking, the silence between them soft and easy. Then, without turning, she said quietly, "You gave me back my life." Eli looked at her, the corners of his mouth lifting just a little beneath the brim of his hat. "No, ma'am," he said, voice rough with something like reverence. "You gave me mine." The words hung in the air between them, simple but heavy, and for once, neither tried to fill the silence that followed. The wind swept through the tall grass, carrying the scent of wild sage, and somewhere out in the distance, a coyote called to the fading light. The world felt still again, not with the stillness of loss, but of peace, rare and earned. Mary smiled then, the kind of smile that reached her eyes and seemed to touch the very edges of the horizon. Eli tipped his hat, not out of habit this time, but out of quiet gratitude for her, for the land, for the chance he never thought he'd get again. The sun slipped below the ridge, turning the sky to fire one last time before dusk claimed it. And for the first time in years, the Rawlins ranch didn't feel haunted. It felt like home,